When you look head on into the future of your ranch, are your management decisions and day-to-day operations creating a viable multi-generational business, or is it over when you're done?
Some people would rather go broke running their place the way they are than change and keep it going for another generation. So
making critical management changes in your operation that move away from traditional practices can be hard. Kurt Myllymaki, a rancher and farmer in Stanford, Montana, joins me today as we talk about how they migrated their operation away from some traditional practices they felt were creating too much stress and strain on their land, livestock, and their own quality of life, and in the long run, the future of their operation.
There's a lot of pressure to keep doing things the way that previous generations have done things or the way your neighbors do them.
What were some of those changes they made? Find out on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And welcome to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Thanks for joining us here on our program. And if this is your very first time of listening to Working Ranch Radio Show, we thank you for tuning in. And if by chance you're listening on the radio and you have to step away for a minute and you want to go back and listen to it again, you can find all of our shows that we had on workingranchradio.com is the podcast site. Or if you have a more preferred podcast site like Pandora or Spotify or Google or Apple or any of those, you can go and listen to it through that as well. Want to mention, we were looking through some records the other day. We have listeners in over 83 countries. Yeah, over 83 countries that listen to the Working Ranch Radio Show. So for those listening in Australia here for this week's show, a shout out to you. Throw another shrimp on the bobby, shall we? And we appreciate you tuning in here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. On our program here today, we have Kurt Myllymaki joining us. He is with Myllymaki Farms out of Stanford, Montana. Now, their ranch is also the Montana Leopold Conservation Award winners for 2023. And we're going to talk about some of the practices that they have moved ahead with in the last several years to not only from a conservation standpoint, which is what that award recognized, but they were also doing it not for the award. They were doing it because they realized that if they didn't make some changes, the financial viability of their ranching operation and farming operation could be in jeopardy down the road. So we're going to talk about some of those changes that they made, and I think you'll find it interesting as we have that discussion today with Kurt Myllymaki. He and his wife, PJ, their two kids, Katie and Cameron, and his dad, Bruce, all on their ranching operation there in Stanford, Montana. So be sure to tune in for that. Right now, thank you to our sponsors of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Allflex cattle identification and record keeping should be easy. You can tie your visual tag, EID tag, and your genetic data to one management number with the Allflex match sets. You can find out more at allflexusa.com. Inherit Select from Zoetis, providing commercial cow-calf producers with genetic insight to make replacement female selection and breeding decisions. Find out more at inheritprogress.com. The American Gelbvieh Association, a highly fertile, moderately framed cow that raises high-performing calves even in tough environments. Now that's doing more with less. The Gelbvieh cow's efficient use of resources make her the picture of sustainability in today's modern beef industry. Find out more at gelbvieh.org. And MLS Tubs. Don't gamble with breeding season. MLS Tubs are a sure bet. Learn more about MLS Tubs at mlstubs.com. And finally, Tank Toad. It's the remote water monitoring system we use here on the X-Ring Ranch. I can keep an eye on my water supply, the cistern tanks, from the convenience of my phone with satellite or cell type systems. Call Metalark Solutions today for tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more at 801-252-6135 or their website, tanktoad.com. Well, let's check in now with the Captain Tim O'Byrne for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. First of all, a big shout out to all of you that join us on our Facebook Friday post. You guys let us know what you're doing in photography and video, and just touching base with stories. We just love it when you do that. Justin, my 2 cents today is it's about your last episode. Your guest was Keith Harmony with KSU, and you talked about drought strategies and that sort of thing. And you mentioned, you asked a really good question, the difference between stocking rate and stocking density. And I want you to let us know what that definition, what the difference is again, just so everybody kind of gets it in their head. Because I know I had to rewind it a couple of times, and it was a great point. So hit it.
All right, Captain. Well, I'll try to do the best I can. Here are some simplistic ways to look at those two terms of stocking rate versus stocking density. Now, stocking rate is just the measure of the land's carrying capacity or amount of its forage production. And of course, forage production has a lot to do with precipitation and where you're at. So in drier climates, for example, where we're at here in northeastern Wyoming, our stocking rate number would sound something like this, that it takes 35 acres to run a cow. Usually that would be considered a cow-calf pair for the year, for a given year. So that would be our number here. Now, for folks in more wetter climates that have more forage production, you're going to hear their stocking rate number sound more like this, and it's going to be X amount of cows per acre. So that's stocking rate. Stocking density, on the other hand, is just the amount of stock present on the land at any given time, and it really has a lot to do with an indicator of management techniques. For example, mob grazing or high intensive grazing, where they're going to bring those animals together and create a higher stocking density, but make smaller paddocks in an effort to improve soil conditions and improve grass growth. And also, they're going to hit those areas and be off them, give them a long rest period and not come back. Again, it's more of a management technique than it is has to do with really the carrying capacity. Again, stocking rate is carrying capacity. Stocking density is just the amount of stock present on the land. So I hope that's as clear as mud for you. And it was a good show. Our last show, episode 121. Now, last week we actually didn't have a show. We had to rerun the previous week's show because I had a little bit of a horse wreck and ended up breaking my ankle with the horse that fell and rolled with me. We recovered. Hopefully, we got to be off the foot for a little bit, but that's why we didn't have a show last week. We're on the mend, and it's a terrible time of the year to be having to deal with this, but nevertheless, that's just the way the cookie crumbles, so we're moving forward. Well, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to get into our show here today as Kurt Myllymaki will be joining us. We're going to be talking about some of the changes they made in their operation as they looked at how this would look for the future of passing this down to the next generation. We'll talk about that when we return on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Now let's hear what Two Rivers Land and Cattle of Miami County, Kansas has to say about MLS tubs.
MLS number one tubs have given my operation a big boost. We had over 50% of our cows serviced in the first 21 days, and 93% of our heifers bred in 60 days this past year. The tubs release rate is consistent and convenient for our cattle row crop operation. We made a good decision switching to MLS.
Don't gamble with breeding season. MLS tubs are a sure bet. Learn more about MLS tubs at mlstubs.com. And we welcome you to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills as we head now into our featured interview here today as we talk about, a lot of us in the ranching industry, for a lot of us, we've grown up in the industry. Maybe you haven't, and yet you've been around other places that have done things over the last several years, and at some point you know that maybe some changes need to be made. And so our show here today is going to be focusing a little bit on that as we visit with a ranching and a farming operation out of Montana that has made that evolution of change in their operation in ways that they knew that in order to be sustainable, in order to get to the next generation, it was going to require some changes, and we're going to talk about that here today. So joining me on our program is Kurt Myllymaki. Kurt, thanks for joining us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Well, this time of the year for any of us is busy, and I know you're probably in the middle of calving and at the same time spring crops and a lot of things, so I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Before we get into some of the details that I really want to get into, let's talk a little bit about Stanford, Montana. Almost if you just drew an X through Montana, you'd almost land in Stanford, Montana. And so let's talk about, first of all, the climate there and what if you were looking out your window right now, describe what we'd be seeing.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, Stanford, Montana is located in Judith Basin County, which is right about in the center of the state. And we can see 7 different groups of mountains from our yard here. And we get plenty of wind and not much rain the last couple of years, but on a normalish sort of year, we'd be 12 to 14 inches. Fairly open winters. We get Chinook winds which warm up and take care of most of our snow. But I guess the wind, we're never usually the hot spot in the state, and we're never usually the cold spot too often. Mm-hmm. But it's a pretty good spot here in the middle of the state, and we've had a good amount of moisture this year, so it's been a good change from the last 2 years of drought and grasshoppers and whatnot. So
yeah, you hit on wind a couple times. We'll go back to that, folks, and I think you need to understand that wind erosion is a big deal in this part of the country. In fact, in the Judith Basin there, they also have wind turbines. So if that gives you any indication, wind in that part of the country is a big deal, and we're going to talk a bit about why they've made some of the changes that really has a lot to do with wind erosion in that. Let's talk about just typically if you're going to drive around the county of Judith Basin County in Montana, what would we see for enterprises that the ranches or farms what would we see when we were driving around the county? So
the Stanford area is more heavy cow-calf operations, multi-generational family places, ranches. We're close to the Little Belt Mountains, and so there's mountain places, and then we're more out on the flats, and so there's a little bit of everything. And then we get closer into the Arrow Creek breaks, and Arrow Creek runs into the Missouri then, or into the Judith right before the Missouri River. But so there's a difference in topography, but there is a lot of diversity of crops that are grown in the area too. Wheat is our main one, but then we also have malt barley and a lot of pulse crops, peas, chickpeas, lentils that are grown in the area as well. And there's a lot of wheat continuous crop all of our farm ground, but there is a lot of fallow ground in the area and a lot of hay production. Most years, last 2 years has been an importer of hay into this region, but normally would be a big exporter of hay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And not much irrigation also. Very, very little irrigation in the area. It's almost all dry land, farm ground, and hay ground. Mm-hmm. Well, Kurt, we're going to get into basically where you started from several years ago, what you saw as you knew that this was going to be an operation you were going to be taking over. Your dad is there on the place with you as well, but knowing that really there were going to be some changes that needed to be made. And folks, before we get into that, one of the things I do want to note here, and I failed to mention this at the very beginning, but Myllymaki Farms there in Stanford, they are this year's Montana Leopold Conservation Award winner. And Kurt and his wife PJ and his kids Katie and Cameron are on the place there. And really the point of this is that it recognizes operations that are putting into place conservation practices. And so we're going to talk about that in a bit. But if we were to step back 10, 15 years ago, Kurt, what did you see in the operation that just said, we're going to have to make some changes here? Yeah. So about 8-9 years ago, we used to calve in, we'd start like the very last couple of days of January, and we'd calve through February and March. And we had started to do some, this was like 2014, 2015. So again, when the cattle market was at a high, mm-hmm. and we were making pretty good money, but we knew it wouldn't last forever, and we wanted to figure out a way that we could expand and continue to make money the way we were then. And so our calving in February, that particular time, we had a really bad winter one year, and we had 30 below 40 below wind chills for a week. And we knew that to continue that time of year, if we wanted to expand our herd, we'd have to put up another barn, and because we had kind of outgrown our old one. And so then I started looking into how could we eliminate feeding hay, and then which led us into like May, June calving, which also eliminated the need for a barn. And so that's kind of where we ended up taking our place, was to really address our hay feeding, and then also just not having to put as much money into capital expenses, I guess. That was kind of what led us into that change about 2015-ish.
Mm-hmm. Kurt, real quick, a couple questions in regard to that change that you made there. First of all, I know that calving in February in that part of Montana, especially where you see a lot more farming enterprises in there, that early calving is kind of a normal thing. What'd the neighbors think when you made the change?
I didn't get too much as far as comments. I guess it was, I think that first year when we did it, it was really a pretty nice February. And so there was a lot of people that said, well, I bet you wish you were calving now. And, but because our cows weren't at a nutritional requirement that we had to feed, we weren't feeding any hay that February. So it didn't really bother me that it was nice out. It was nice for all of them to be calving. But there is a lot of people that farm that like to get the calving done and over with before they get in the fields. And it does make for a busy time for us in May and in June when we're calving and farming. But we don't have to do as much with them either as we used to. When we were in February and March, we used to do night checks and run them through a barn and band them and tag them and run them through jugs and cleaning out a barn and bedding the barn. And we don't have to do any of that stuff anymore. And so it's really, it's a lot better quality of life. And then we're making, we're doing well money wise too with those changes, not feeding any or little hay.
Yeah. Real quick, from a very technical standpoint, when you made that move with your cow herd, did you just take your cow herd down to that time frame? And if you did you see did you have any issues when you did that, or did you sell out and buy May calvers? So
no, we kept our own cows, and we did the move in 1 year from February 1st to or so till to August. Well, it was August 1st turnout, which is May 10th. Mm-hmm. And we just did it in 1 year. And we had a really good breed up that first year, like 96%. And so we were pretty happy with it and thought that was fairly easy transition to make. But yeah, there is some people that have sold their cows. I guess we were used to our cows. We knew our cows. They knew our place. And so that's why we decided not to do that. And we had some fallout the first year or two, just cows that wouldn't fit into that system, that were harder keepers, that either didn't make it through the winter that well, or when they got onto green grass had too much milk. And then when we were calving and they just got little tiny baby calves, ones that weren't really a problem back when we were feeding hay, by the time we hit green grass, their calves were plenty big to keep up with them. But then when they got to where they were out on green grass or a grass alfalfa mix for a while, and we had some pretty big milk cow looking cows out there for a while, but it took some time, and we knew that would maybe be the case, but we just wanted to kind of let nature run its course and pick them out for us, I guess. Yeah. Kurt
Myllymaki is my guest here today. Their family ranch, Myllymaki Farms, out of Stanford, Montana. They are this year's Montana Leopold Conservation Award. We are talking about, our whole show today is going to be dedicated about how they made that transition from being a pretty high-intensive labor standpoint operation to moving away from some of that labor for a lot of reasons. We've talked about some of those already. We're going to continue our conversation with Kurt when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Every year you pick your replacement heifers. Some become profitable cows. Others disappoint. How can you make more reliable selections? Genetic testing. Commercial cow-calf producers like you are using Inherit Select from Zoetis. You gain valuable predictions, including cow fertility, size and soundness, feed efficiency, growth and carcass merit, as well as easy-to-use economic indexes. This improves your selection, breeding, and marketing decisions. Request a call from inheritprogress.com and ask about free TSUs to get you started.
And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. My guest today is Kurt Myllymaki out of Stanford, Montana with Myllymaki Farms. We're talking about the change that they've made in their ranching operations back to about 2014 is when they started making some changes, knowing that some of the labor that they were putting into their ranch and farming operations just could not be sustained if they were for several reasons, whether it was a financial situation or whether it was just a quality of life that they wanted to have. And so, Kurt, again, thanks for joining us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we talked in the last segment a little bit about your cattle operation, let's touch briefly a bit on your farming operation. I got to tell you, before we started the conversation here today, Kurt asked me, he said, hey, is it okay if we talk about farming because you're a ranching show? And I said, oh, absolutely. There's a lot of folks that are ranchers and farmers both, but I know, and you talked a bit ago about wind, and I know that drove a lot of your decision making in terms of how you changed and evolved with your farming practices. So let's talk about what was happening prior to the changes you made, and then let's talk about what you did to address those issues that you were concerned about.
Okay. Well, yeah, we've never had real significant wind erosion on our place, but we've seen it in our area for sure. And a lot of it is fallow ground and pulse crops that just don't leave very much above ground residue, especially after they're harvested. And so we didn't want to be in that sort of an issue, and continuous cropping really addresses that for the most part, just having something growing on the field as much as possible, but then and not disturbing the soil. So we went about 7-8 years. We went to a disc drill, no-till disc drill, and then also a stripper header for harvesting our small grains. And so that has really allowed us to have a lot more protection for the soil from the winds, and it's protects the new seedlings that come the next year when they're just little. When we say wind here, I mean we can get 60, 70, 80 mile an hour winds at times, and so it can do a lot of damage in a hurry if the ground's bare out there. But then that more residue, we get it down on the soil. Then when we cover it, it stays cooler, which helps the soil biology and also makes our limited moisture last longer, because the wind will dry the ground out quicker too, and it makes it last a lot longer if we can keep the ground covered. So
tell us how you're integrating the ranching operation with the farming operation. And I know you got cover crops growing and some grazing on some of these crops. Let's talk about the integration between those two segments of your operation.
Yeah, they used to be pretty much separate. We had a lot of farm ground that's just out that didn't have fences on it, and so we've gone through and fenced off most of our deeded acres with permanent electric fence, and then we graze crop aftermath and regrowth and volunteer stuff, and then we also seed about 10% of our acres into cover crops every year, multi-species, warm season dominant cover crops that we graze then in the late fall and into the winter to give our grazing land more rest and recovery time, and then also to integrate our livestock into the farm ground. And we do it that time of year because our farm ground doesn't have water on it, and we have to, at least as of today, we still have to haul water to them. And so if we're in there in the winter time, this is after we've weaned, so the cows aren't lactating anymore, and if we get some snow moisture, they just don't have the water requirements, and it's not that big of a job, I guess, to haul them water. And we are moving our cows as much as possible, and so a lot of times we're just hauling out once a day and moving them, and then we're done. So it's not too big of a deal for the amount of hay that we're saving in the operation.
Kurt, I'm going to ask you a question that I feel like I can ask because you've got some publicity on your ranching operation, farming operation about the scope and size of your ranch. But normally, as ranchers, and we don't really ask each other how big is your ranch, how many cattle you're running. But in light of the fact that you have some public accolades here on this, let's talk about the size and the scope of your operations.
Okay, so we farm about 6,000 acres of dryland farm ground, and then we run, the whole place deeded and leased is around 10,000 acres, but that's about 4,000 then of grazing lands. And we were running close to 300 head a couple years ago, but because of destocking during the drought, we're about half of that right now. So we're at about 150 mother cows. And then we also background our own calves over the winter and then do some custom feeding of replacement heifer calves.
Okay. I should have thrown that question in earlier, but I forgot to ask you that. So, okay, I want to go quickly back to the grazing and on some of your farm ground that you've done or you're doing. Making that change of not haying to grazing, was that a tough decision? And tell me, as you went through that mentally, how did that go?
Well, it was a fairly easy decision at the time. We had fairly new haying equipment, and so we were able to get a pretty good amount of money from selling the haying equipment, and then we started grazing those hay fields, and so that allowed us to graze more days. And then at the time, hay wasn't priced like it is these last 2 years. It was fairly cheap, and I felt like we could buy it. I mean, I was buying those first few years after we sold that, we were buying a lot of hay for $80 a ton, and that with the cost of what we were paying for hay and the machinery and everything, I felt like we were better off buying it at that price than we were putting up our own. And anytime you hay stuff, and then if it's not, a lot of ours wasn't fed back on that same hay field, so we're taking that residue and carbon off of that field and then we're feeding it in a lot. It just was a bad move for our soils as far as cycling through the soil. And so we thought it was a better move for us financially, and it freed up a lot more time for us to do other things in the summer that there was a little bit of a burnout factor in that too, that we went from calving at that time when we were calving in February and March, we went from calving to seeding to spraying to haying to harvest and then to seeding again in the fall. And we never really got too much of a break to do anything. And then when we got to the fall and we were supposed to start fall projects, then we were like, nah, I don't think we're going to get to that this year. And so it was nice to kind of free up that time. And it worked good. We had a neighbor at the time that had bought the haying equipment from us, and he had a lot of cows and not much hay ground. And so it worked out fairly well that he didn't have a bunch of other haying to do. And then he'd get to ours. He was kind of able to just do ours. And so it got put up in a good, timely fashion, and it worked out well. Yeah.
Kurt, you talked about, when you first started this, the hay was pretty cheap those years. And I remember that. I remember being able to buy hay several years ago. And I think one winter when I had to buy a little bit of hay, my average price was $105 a ton, delivered in, sitting in here. Yeah. But that's not the case the last couple of years. How did you get through the last couple of years with these exorbitant prices on hay? What did you do from a management standpoint?
Well, so the first year, because we hadn't fed much hay over the last 2 years, or the previous couple of years. 2 years ago, we got through with minimal hay. We had grown a decent amount of grass early that year before it got really dry. And then the hay that we were feeding over the winter that year was still that $80 a ton hay, even though it was 2-3 years old. And it was still in good quality. And so we were able to get by without feeding too much hay that first year. But this last year, we had to buy quite a bit, and it was expensive, and some of it came from far eastern Montana and some of it came from Idaho, but it was good quality hay, and we just got through it like everybody else. But it wasn't ideal. I would prefer to graze all year, and the way this year is starting out, it looks like we can hopefully get back to that, where we used to feed when we calved in February and March. We would feed, I think it's pretty common for guys around here to feed 2 to 3 tons per cow over the winter.
Wow.
And we were probably doing 400 to 500 pounds.
Oh, really?
The last few years until this year. And we were probably back up to that, maybe 1.5 tons. So still not, because we had reduced our herd size, and we had some volunteer winter wheat that we were able to graze last fall, and so that helped. But we didn't even graze our cover crops last year because they didn't. That was part of the wind erosion, I guess. Getting back to that is cover crops. Cows love warm season grasses and collards and turnips and stuff, and they'll just eat it down to bare ground. So as far as the grazing that we do, I mean, I've seen guys seed cover crops, turn their cows out in there and just leave them, and then their fields blow by the middle of winter because it's 50 degrees and there's no snow and the wind's blowing 50 miles an hour. And so we left that residue there, which wasn't a whole lot between the drought and grasshoppers, that we just left it there for the soil, and we didn't do it, and we had to buy more hay because of that. But I think ultimately in the long run, it was a better move for our land.
Yeah. Kurt Myllymaki is my guest today with Myllymaki Farms out of Stanford, Montana. We're talking about the changes that they've made over the last several years, moving from a very high intensive labor operation, ranching and farming operation, to moving more to a little bit less intensive in some of those times of the year, and calving in the winter, and then spring planting. And as he went through that list of things that they were busy from February all the way till Thanksgiving probably, and just really seeing some burnout in that, talking about how they've made some changes over the last several years to correct some of that. We're going to continue with Kurt. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about some infrastructure, and just if he was to sit down with you and just say, here's the things I've learned, we're going to ask him what those things are when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. A sustainable ranch is one that can do more with less, and for beef producers, it can start right at the herd level with a cow that's efficient with her resources and environment. And in today's modern industry, Gelbvieh females are the picture of sustainability. Gelbvieh and Balancer cattle are early maturing with maternal superiority through increased longevity, added fertility, and more pounds of calf wean per cow exposed. Adaptable, versatile, and sustainable. All factors that have a positive impact on your bottom line. Gelbvieh influenced females, the smart, reliable, and profitable maternal choice for achieving sustainability in today's modern beef industry. Be sustainable, breed Gelbvieh. And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. My guest today is Kurt Myllymaki with Myllymaki Farms. He's out of Stanford, Montana. He, his wife PJ, and their kids Katie and Cameron, and his dad Bruce, they all work there, a part of the ranching and farming operation there. And we've talked about already in our previous 2 segments about where they were, where they've evolved to, and how what some of those changes were, in an effort to knowing that really from a sustainability standpoint. When I say sustainability, I'm not talking necessarily environmental sustainability. I mean the fact that they're wanting to be in operation in the future, and that involves not only our environment, but it also involves making a profit and being mindful in managing your labor, your time, your resources. And so with those changes that they made, we talked a little bit about that. Kurt, I want to get a bit into some infrastructure, some things that as you made these changes, you're sitting across the table from somebody and say, okay, here's some infrastructure things that you really need to be considered looking at. What were some of those, and what are some of those things that you would suggest?
Okay. So the main thing, I guess, that like with our operation is that we use the cows to, our focus is on the grazing and how we graze the cows. And we use the cows as a tool to grow more grass. So we're doing as high a stock density as we feel that we're comfortable with. If we didn't do any farming, I would probably do a higher stock density, or if we had yearlings. But with cow calf as intense as we can, or as high stock density as we can, and so we move every day as much as we can throughout the year, and we give as long a rest periods as we can. And we've seen, I feel like it's made our land more resilient, where it really took off this year once we saw some moisture. And I guess the thing that I would recommend to people is putting a focus on grazing so that you can feed less hay, because that ultimately with cow-calf operation is our, well, it was our biggest expense. I guess now depreciation would be, but it's probably, it's in, if you can swing it, like this year, if we're getting paid, $300, $400, $500 more for our calves. Yeah. And then if you can reduce your cost by a couple hundred more per head, well, then that starts to look a lot better. And so we do a lot of electric fencing, a lot of poly wire, and those are pretty cheap investments, moving temporary fence. I personally wouldn't put up a barbed wire fence ever again because of just how, I guess that's something I just do is analyze different costs of things that we just don't use anymore. I bought a dart gun for giving shots on the range because I thought we'd need it, and I haven't used it for a couple of years now because we just don't see sick animals. And I think it's due to our grazing and that our cows are always on a high plane of nutrition year round. And so to me, the focus on cow-calf operations needs to be on the grazing end and not on how you put up hay and how to feed hay and stuff like that. I guess we just try to let nature do as much, I guess, as it can and try to stay out of its way and learn from what we observe out there. I guess we don't, like when we're calving, we don't touch the calves. We don't tag, we don't band, we do it all later. We just let them be with their moms and we keep moving them. And as long as everybody's doing good, we just keep moving along and grazing and letting it regrow. And when I say long rest periods, I'm talking anywhere from 12 to 18 months before we'll come back. So we're there for one day in the growing season. It might be less than that if we come back during the dormant time, but a lot of times it's not. It ends up being that. Especially when we opened up, a couple thousand acres or 3,000 acres of farm ground to also graze. And so I'm a big proponent of electric fence. And I guess that would be my biggest thing in trying to cut out as many expenses as a guy can.
Real quick, I want you to circle back to this real quick. You'd mentioned something about the rest or recovery period being anywhere from could be a 12 to 18 months. When you're on a spot for a day or so and you move off that, did you come back in it in the dormant season or not? It just doesn't see a cow for 12 to 18 months, or do you come back to it in the dormant season?
We don't usually come back in the dormant season, but we have before at the home place here when we've weaned calves. Maybe we've let them out and, instead of feeding them in a lot, maybe we'll feed them and they'll have access to it a little bit in the dormant season, but not in the grazing season. We tried that at first. We kind of were under this impression of, or I was, that maybe we could graze stuff, give it 45 days or 60 days and come back. And you could, but we've, like the stuff that we started grazing the first part of May when we started calving, it looks, it's fully recovered or back bigger and better than when we grazed it the first time. But we've always seen where it doesn't do as well the following year when we've done stuff a second time in the growing season. So like if we came back even early fall on that stuff, then in 24, it doesn't seem to do as well in the years that we've done that, but we just have kind of gone away from that, I guess. And yeah, if you get a bunch of rain, it covers up mistakes or things like that, that happen, I guess. I don't like to use the word mistakes, but, I talk with the kids about learning opportunities. And so when we have something that doesn't go to plan, if we can learn from it and do better the next time, then I guess it really wasn't a mistake. But
okay. So you brought it up. I was going to ask this already, but you brought it up. So what are your biggest learning opportunities that you've had? Okay. We're not going to use the M word. We'll just say just if you could go back to the last several years, one or two of your biggest learning opportunities.
I guess whenever we've tried to get in the way too much, because we were used to when we calved in February and March, you felt like you had to be so involved. And I think sometimes when we get more involved than we should, then that's led to some problems. But it seems like if we, we used to do a back fence behind the cows every day too. And it was more work than it needed to be done. When you move them every day, they move into the new paddock. And they don't go back because they've already eaten all the good stuff and whatnot. And so just that would be an example of just, we just open it up and we just move a back fence every few days or whatever, because this time of year we'll see regrowth in 3 days. And so we try to stay at least 3 moves behind them with the back fence, but they don't usually go back, but we don't like to give them the opportunity to, but, it's just a constant thing every day or every kind of different grazing situation we get in. Like we went from kind of an alfalfa grass mix to then winter wheat regrowth volunteer to then back into alfalfa grass hayfield that was probably like 2 tons to the acre. So it's just a, constant of like, well, some days our moves are 10 acres and some days they're only like 3, and just trying to do that every day is just, there's plenty of time for learning opportunities, I guess, in that regard. But I guess we've been pretty fortunate in all of our changes that I guess I look into them quite a bit, maybe sometimes too much before we do them, so that we're right along the highway 80 here. And so when we're doing something different, everybody sees it. So we're pretty sure of what we're doing before we do it. So nothing huge, I guess, that would make people laugh at me, I guess, on your podcast, I guess
part of the reason I asked that is because sometimes I think we don't move forward because we're afraid of the failure of it. And so for folks that are considering some of these changes or some of these thoughts that are like, okay, I hear what you're saying, I understand, I want to do that, but just the fear of making those changes, what would you tell somebody?
Well, I guess I would tell them to look at their current operation, and if they felt like it was not sustainable, then I would encourage them to look into, if it's a cow-calf operation, or maybe they don't even have to be a cow-calf operation. Maybe it's a yearling operation instead of what, maybe it's a wrong enterprise in their particular environment, and not be afraid to. There's a lot of pressure to keep doing things the way that previous generations have done things, or the way your neighbors do them. And I didn't feel like what we were doing was sustainable. Like, it's still fairly intensive as far as labor with daily moves and stuff like that, but the management is more intensive instead of the labor. Like, I don't get up in the middle of the night to check cows like we used to. Sometimes in February we'd be up all night. Well, that to me wasn't sustainable. I wasn't going to do that forever. I looked at it and said, well, someday, I'm not going to have my dad there helping me, and my kids are too little, and I'm not going to be able to stay up all night and all day. And I didn't want to, I guess, live that way. And so I guess when we first started doing this, I thought, well, people ask me and I'll try to get them to maybe change, but I've kind of given up on that. If people want to change, I'm there to, because we didn't really have anybody in our area that was doing this kind of stuff for calving this time. And so I'm more than willing, I guess, to talk to people when they want to, but people have to want to do it, kind of on their own, and just decide if they want to do it. I know you and I are both Ranching for Profit alum, and I think either somebody that was teaching the class or somebody at the class, I remember saying that some people would rather go broke running their place the way they are than change and keep it going for another generation. So I think people just have to decide what they want to do. But to me, feeding hay, especially now when it's, I don't know if we'll ever see $80 a ton hay again, but I just think it's not sustainable to do that, to feed hay and to work against nature all the time like that, I guess.
You bet. Well, Kurt, I appreciate you taking the time. As I said before, this is a busy time of the year for you, so I appreciate you taking the time to join us here. And congratulations to you and your family on the winning the Montana Leopold Conservation Award. That's an award that, folks, if you don't know what that means, there's a lot to go into that talks about the conservation practices that they've put into place. And so congratulations on that, and thanks for joining us here.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me.
And again, my guest today, Kurt Myllymaki with Myllymaki Farms out of Stanford, Montana. Congratulations to them. They are the Montana Leopold Conservation Award winners for 2023, joining the list of several great ranching and agricultural families, not only in Montana, but other states that do the Leopold Conservation Awards. Congratulations to them. And interesting to always visit with somebody as they've made that change over the last few years into to some very, very big changes to their ranching operations and the way they used to do things to the way they do now. That's always a challenge in the minds first before we actually put it into practice. So I hope for folks that might be considering that or thinking on these things, maybe this program here today is one that would give you some insight as you move forward. Like he said, he is willing to visit with folks about some of the changes that they've made. So if you want to reach out to him, you sure can. I will put a link to his email address in the description of our podcast website here today. Well, coming up next, meteorologist Don Day steps in and joins us as we take a look at our long-term weather. The North American monsoon season, where is it at? Why is there a delay in it? We're going to talk about it when we come back on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Do you have a young child, grandchild, niece, or nephew that loves the weather and wants to learn more? Day Weather has produced a children's weather journal full of weather facts, fun weather experiments, coloring pages, and pages to record weather observations for every season of the year. The weather journal is for ages 3 to 7 and designed to be fun and educational. The interactive weather projects are fun for the whole family to take part in. For only $10, the Day Weather Journal is a great gift idea for any occasion. Click on our Amazon link to order at dayweather.com.
And we welcome you back to the Working Ranch Radio Show as we take a look now at our long-term weather today, brought to you by Allflex. Cattle identification and record keeping should be easy. So now you can tie your visual tag and that EID tag and your genetic data to one management number with the Allflex match sets. You can find out more at allflexusa.com. And joining us this week, as he does each and every week, is meteorologist Don Day. Don, thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Don, before we get into the full extended look at our forecast, I want to talk a little bit about what's happening to the north. And for a lot of us across the country, at different times, the last several weeks, we've probably experienced some smoke that's been coming from those very severe fires up in Canada. But it looks like, though, that they're going to start to see some moisture into British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan that in hopes might dampen these fires just a little bit.
Yeah, there's a really good chance for a wet pattern developing over the prairie provinces of Canada, but also the mountainous terrain as well into Alberta and eastern British Columbia's. Not only one, but two storm systems are going to slowly move through there and kind of put that part of Canada in a cooler and occasionally wet weather pattern. And it's just not kind of come and going. It's going to be lasting for several days where off and on chances of rain and cooler temperatures and higher humidity. You know, a lot of times just some cloudy days with higher humidity can be very effective at, slowing down fire activity. And then you throw rain on top of it, and that really helps. Now, whether or not it's enough to put those fires out for good or something that they don't have to worry about for the rest of the year, probably not, but it's certainly going to help.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's talk about our weather situation here in the continental U.S. and the fact that this time of the year we start to see these thunderstorms, this movement. A lot of that has to do with the North American monsoon. And typically the southern part of the country, that New Mexico, Arizona, and in that area start to see some of those moistures, but we're not. And so why are we seeing a delay in the monsoon, or are we going to have a monsoon season this year?
Yeah, well, those are all good questions. To familiarize folks with what we're talking about, the North American monsoon is just a natural flow of moisture that comes up through Mexico, out of Central America, also the Gulf of California, the Gulf of Mexico. And during the month of June, we usually start to see this moisture manifest itself into the formation of showers and thunderstorms over Arizona, New Mexico, sometime the deserts of California as well. And then as we get into July and as we get into August, there's usually a more northward expansion of that moisture getting into the Central Rockies and parts of the Southern Plains, the Western Southern Plains, and the Central Plains. And a lot of the July and August and early September precipitation in many parts of the Southwest and Western United States comes from this pattern. And what drives it, what really gets it going, is just the natural process of the heat that builds in the summer. When the deserts start to get really hot, that causes pressure patterns to change, that helps draw that moisture along the divide, and northward. Now, what we had last year was a very robust monsoon season. We saw great rain last summer in Arizona and New Mexico, parts of southwestern Texas, then especially Colorado had a really good monsoon season last year. But this year's different. It's been delayed. Usually it really gets into gear about now. But what's interesting about the fact that it's not kicking into gear yet is because it was so cool this winter in the desert Southwest. I mean, for the first 5 months of 2023, temperatures have been below average, and that has kept the deserts cooler. It's also kept the water temperatures in the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico, but especially the Gulf of California near that Baja area. The temperatures are off to a late start, and the temperature is really what starts to drive that monsoon pattern. So what it means is it's going to be a shortened monsoon, which means it won't be as productive as it was last year, and it's going to be off to a later start. So it's probably a couple of weeks before it really kicks into gear. So while the rain and the snow this winter in Arizona and New Mexico was great, they're going to see a little bit of a deficit early in this monsoon season with its late start.
But the pattern when it does start will probably be similar to what we've seen in the past, where it comes up from there and is far north. I mean, you've said before that it can far north as maybe Montana, but it kind of the thoroughfare of it is through Nebraska, South Dakota line as it curves to the east. Is that just a pattern that it's going to stay? And I'm mainly asking this because I'm wondering, is it going to affect anything? It's been dry in the Midwest. Are they going to see anything eventually?
Well, yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of times some of this same subtropical moisture can work its way into the Corn Belt. If you look at some of the big floods historically in the Corn Belt and Midwest, it's been partially due to this pattern. But I think that since it's getting a late start, and we're noticing that the jet stream here all the way into the middle of June is still taking a more southerly route, what that tends to do is bottle up the monsoon more into Arizona, New Mexico, and more along Interstate 70 and as far north as I-80. Now, at times it will surge northward, but I think it's going to take more of that southern route, which means I think that the Midwest and Corn Belt will be getting some rain, but I'm still expecting, especially that Northwest Corn Belt, Iowa, eastern Nebraska, parts of Missouri and Northeast Kansas, Minnesota, and eastern South Dakota. It's not going to be enough for them to kind of right the ship, so to speak. I think that part of the Corn Belt is going to end up in a moisture deficit for the whole season.
All right. Well, Don, appreciate the update. Thanks for joining us here this week.
Thank you.
And again, that is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. His website can be found at dayweather.com. That's where I go every morning to take a look and listen to what he's got in store for our weather forecast for the day. You can find a link to his daily video podcast. Our weather today brought to you by Allflex. Cattle identification and record keeping should be easy. Learn more at allflexusa.com. Well, stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll put a wrap on this week's show when we come back on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, you're not going to want to miss it. We're going to be talking cattle market outlook as Brett Stewart with Global Agri Trends will be joining us to talk not only on what he is seeing for our U.S. and domestic cattle supply and herd numbers, but also we're going to look at that from a global perspective as well. And let me just put it this way. Things are looking pretty up. They have been, and he's got some information that I think will give us a lot more insight of what this cattle market's going to do for the coming years. So be sure to tune in next week as we talk with Brett Stewart of Global Agri Trends on our cattle market outlook. Just want to remind you that, again, you can catch any of our shows by going to our podcast website at workingranchradio.com. And if you hear something, let us know. Give us a thumbs up, give us a like, however you're listening to it, comments. We appreciate those comments as well. And if you have questions, you can sure send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. A thank you to our sponsors today, Allflex, Inherit Select from Zoetis, the American Gelbvieh Association, MLS Tubs, and Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring system. It's what we use here on the X-Ring Ranch. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. And let me tell you, if it's not sitting on your kitchen table right now or in your mailbox, it will be soon. It's the latest issue of Working Ranch Magazine, and as always, it's plumb full, chock full of great articles that are very useful to all of us here in the ranching industry. If you don't have your subscription, you can simply get it started by going to workingranchmag.com. Well, be sure to join us at the same time, same place next week, or on your favorite podcast provider. I'm your host, Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.